This video is for you if you have felt something shifting within yourself, or noticed the world behaving in ways you can't explain. An alien revealed why humans suddenly started changing, and scientists can't explain it. Imagine waking up to a reality where emotions, thoughts, and even motivations no longer follow the patterns we thought were normal, yet the world around us continues as if nothing has changed. What if what you feel is not confusion, not breakdown, but the silent awakening of something ancient inside every human being? Stay with this story, because what you are about to witness will challenge your assumptions and may change how you perceive yourself and those around you. Like, share, and subscribe to join the journey, and comment below where you're listening from, because your awareness matters, and you are not alone. As we dive into the encounter, you will see how one observer from beyond the stars recognized a shift invisible to science, yet undeniable to consciousness itself. Keep watching, and let the story unfold, slowly revealing the truth behind the signals humanity has begun to feel, but cannot yet name. Paul noticed the change before anyone tried to name it. It was not announced. It did not arrive with headlines, alarms, or visible events. It moved quietly, beneath conversations, beneath routines, beneath the constant noise of daily life. People still went to work, cities still glowed at night, systems still functioned, and yet something subtle had shifted, something no instrument seemed able to register. The change appeared first in small, almost dismissible moments. A hesitation before answering simple questions. A vague restlessness without cause. An unfamiliar emptiness appearing in people who outwardly seemed successful, busy, and intact. Paul observed it in strangers, in colleagues, in passing interactions that felt thinner than they once had. Emotions surfaced without clear triggers. Irritation, sadness, detachment, even sudden tenderness. None of it fit existing models. Scientists were measuring everything they could: brain activity, hormones, sleep cycles, attention spans. Data poured in endlessly. Yet nothing explained why so many people reported feeling different without being able to say how. Not sick, not depressed, not enlightened, just altered. As if an internal dial had been adjusted slightly out of alignment, Paul began to sense that the problem was not that the change was invisible, but that it existed in a dimension no one was looking at. It was not chemical, not behavioral, not cultural in any conventional sense. It was experiential, something occurring within awareness itself, subtle enough to evade statistics, yet widespread enough to be felt almost everywhere at once. People described losing interest in things that once defined them: careers, ambitions, arguments. Identities that had felt solid for decades suddenly seemed hollow or strangely irrelevant. Others reported heightened sensitivity, deeper emotional responses, or an unshakable feeling that something important was approaching, though no one could say what. These accounts were dismissed as stress, burnout, or collective fatigue. But Paul knew fatigue did not feel like this. The world had not broken. That was the unsettling part. Nothing obvious was wrong, and yet the atmosphere of human experience felt altered, as if reality itself were quietly recalibrating while everyone argued over surface symptoms. Paul understood then why the change could not be measured. It was not happening to humanity from the outside. It was happening within. And whatever had begun was already underway long before anyone realized there was something to explain. The silence around it suggested intention, patience, and observation than accident. As reports multiplied, the scientific community responded the only way it knew how: by measuring. Laboratories across the world began documenting irregularities that did not fit established frameworks. Anxiety levels rose without corresponding economic or environmental triggers. Empathy appeared heightened in some populations, while emotional withdrawal increased in others. Intuition surfaced in language usually reserved for instinct or coincidence, now spoken of as something persistent and intrusive. Charts showed spikes, graphs revealed deviations. Studies confirmed that something was happening, yet each discipline observed only a fragment. Neuroscience focused on stress responses. Psychology labeled maladaptation. Sociology blamed rapid cultural acceleration. Each explanation functioned in isolation, convincing within its own boundaries, incomplete when viewed together. Paul followed these findings carefully. What unsettled him was not the lack of data, but the confidence with which conclusions were drawn. Researchers treated each symptom as a separate anomaly, never asking why they were emerging simultaneously. Anxiety was treated as pathology, empathy as anomaly, withdrawal as avoidance, intuition as noise. No one asked why all were rising at once. The scientific method demanded variables that could be isolated, controlled, and replicated. What could not be isolated was dismissed. What could not be replicated was downgraded. What involved subjective experience was treated as unreliable by default. Yet the change unfolding did not respect these boundaries. Longitudinal studies showed individuals reporting emotional intensity without narrative cause. Others described sudden detachment from long-held beliefs. Some experienced deep compassion followed by the urge to retreat from social contact entirely. These contradictions were logged but never connected. The assumption remained that unrelated causes must exist. What scientists were witnessing was not a malfunction, it was a reconfiguration. But reconfiguration has no category in models designed to detect failure. Instruments built to identify breakdown could not perceive transformation. Paul recognized the core limitation. Science was observing from the outside, while the change was occurring from within. The tools measured behavior, chemistry, and cognition, but not awareness itself. No device could register shifts in meaning, orientation, or internal reference points. As a result, research focused on mitigation. How to reduce anxiety, how to manage withdrawal, how to dampen emotional volatility. No one considered that these states might be signals rather than symptoms. The anomaly was undeniable. The pattern remained unseen. And so, humanity studied fragments of a phenomenon whose shape existed beyond the lens through which it was being examined. The first voices did not come from institutions or experts. They came quietly from ordinary people who felt something shift inside them and could not explain it. Paul noticed the pattern emerging in conversations, messages, confessions, offered hesitantly, as if admitting something shameful. People said they felt different, but the word felt inadequate, imprecise, unfinished. They spoke of goals losing gravity. Careers pursued for decades suddenly felt hollow. Ambitions once treated as essential now appeared strangely irrelevant, like artifacts from another life. These individuals were not failing. Many were succeeding by every visible metric. Yet success no longer produced satisfaction. The emotional reward system seemed misaligned, delivering silence where fulfillment was expected. Relationships were affected in quieter ways. Some described distance forming without conflict. Love did not vanish, but urgency did. Conversations repeated themselves. Shared plans felt provisional. It was not resentment or betrayal that created separation, but an unspoken sense that something foundational had shifted beneath connection itself. Others reported heightened sensitivity. Emotions arrived with unfamiliar intensity. Beauty triggered tears. Suffering felt unbearable. Noise, crowds, and constant stimulation became exhausting rather than energizing. Many withdrew socially, not from dislike of others, but from an inability to tolerate the volume of the world as it currently operated. Paul noted the recurring confusion. People did not feel broken, they felt misaligned. Medical tests returned normal results. Psychological evaluations offered labels that did not resonate. Burnout, depression, anxiety. None fully captured the experience being described. Something deeper was occurring, something without established language. What disturbed many was the absence of a cause. There was no trauma to point to, no singular event. The change felt internal and gradual, like waking up in a familiar room subtly rearranged overnight. Everything recognizable, yet nothing quite in the right place. Some individuals attempted to correct the sensation by doubling down on old identities, working harder, consuming more, seeking stimulation or distraction. Others did the opposite, slowing down instinctively, retreating into silence without knowing why. Both responses emerged organically, without coordination. Paul understood these accounts were not anomalies. They were early signals surfacing at the individual level before becoming collective awareness. History showed profound shifts never announced themselves first through institutions. They whispered through people who sensed change before understanding it. The discomfort lingered quietly, unresolved, hinting that something vast was unfolding beneath perception, waiting patiently for recognition across humanity as time continued forward. From a distance, nothing appeared wrong. Trains arrived on schedule. Markets opened. Screens refreshed endlessly, with information, entertainment, instruction. Society moved forward, repeating motions perfected over decades. Productivity metrics held, infrastructure endured. The appearance of stability remained intact. Yet Paul sensed an absence that statistics could not register. Conversations flowed but rarely landed. Responses arrived quickly but without depth. People spoke as if reading from internal scripts written long ago, repeating phrases that no longer carried weight. Laughter surfaced easily, yet faded just as fast, leaving no residue. Daily routines continued, but something beneath them felt hollowed out. Work was performed efficiently, though without the quiet satisfaction that once accompanied contribution. Consumption increased, yet fulfillment declined. More options existed than ever before, yet choice felt burdensome rather than liberating. The world functioned, but it did not feel alive in the way history suggested it once had. Paul observed how time itself seemed altered. Days passed faster, weeks blurred together, seasons lost distinction. Many reported the same sensation, a persistent feeling of acceleration without progress, motion without arrival, activity without meaning. The external rhythm remained constant, while the internal experience fractured. Institutions responded by optimizing systems, introducing new platforms, increasing speed. None addressed the underlying disquiet. The assumption was that efficiency equaled health, that motion equaled vitality. But Paul understood that civilizations did not collapse when systems failed. They collapsed when meaning eroded, while systems continued to operate. The most unsettling aspect was normalization. People adjusted quickly. Discomfort was reframed as modern life. Exhaustion became a badge of relevance. Disconnection was labeled independence. Silence was avoided, filled instantly with sound or stimulation. The inability to be still was treated as natural. No alarm sounded because nothing had visibly broken. Yet history taught Paul that this was always how it began. Collapse did not announce itself through catastrophe. It arrived as subtle disorientation, as a quiet loss of coherence that spread beneath functioning structures. The world was still standing. That was the illusion. But foundations were shifting invisibly, not outwardly dramatic, but inwardly profound. And as long as daily life continued uninterrupted, few felt compelled to question what had changed. Paul sensed that humanity was moving through a threshold unnoticed, sustained by momentum rather than intention. Whatever force was at work did not disrupt society. It allowed it to continue. And that, he knew, was what made it most dangerous. Zorvax did not arrive as an interruption. There was no flash, no rupture, no disturbance in the night sky. The world continued exactly as it had moments before, unaware that anything had changed. Paul sensed the presence first as a quiet pressure in awareness, a stillness that did not belong to the surrounding environment. The sensation carried no fear. It carried recognition, a certainty that something observing had already been watching for a long time. The silence deepened, not outwardly, but internally, as if thought itself had paused to listen. Zorvax revealed itself gradually, without urgency, not stepping into reality, but aligning with it. The form was indistinct at first, more suggestion than shape, as though perception itself needed time to adjust. There was no threat conveyed, no dominance, no command, only calm attention. Paul understood immediately that this presence was not reacting to humanity. It was acknowledging a phase. The moment had been anticipated, measured, and patiently awaited. Zorvax did not arrive to warn of disaster or offer salvation. It arrived because a threshold had been crossed quietly, without recognition. There was no spoken greeting. Communication unfolded as understanding rather than sound. The impression was clear. Humanity had entered a familiar stage, one observed many times across different worlds, cultures, and forms of intelligence. The changes Paul had sensed were neither random nor accidental. Zorvax carried no emotion as humans defined it, yet its awareness held weight, not judgment, not concern. Observation sharpened by immense context. Civilizations did not interest it as stories, but as patterns unfolding over time. The presence conveyed that this stage was always subtle. Dramatic arrivals belonged to endings, not transitions. When civilizations truly shifted, it happened beneath attention, while systems remained intact and routines persisted. Paul felt no urge to flee, question, or resist. The calm certainty surrounding Zorvax dissolved the instinct to react. This encounter was not an event, but a clarification. Zorvax had not come to interfere. It had come because humanity was now capable of noticing what previously remained invisible. The arrival itself was not the message, the timing was. And with that understanding settling quietly into awareness, Paul realized the world would look unchanged tomorrow. Yet nothing would ever be the same again. The presence lingered silently beyond perception, patient, precise, and unseen, marking the moment humanity stepped unknowingly into observation rather than isolation for the first time. Zorvax did not describe the change as advancement or decay. Those were human interpretations rooted in comparison and expectation. What was occurring moved beneath such judgments. Humanity was not becoming something better or worse. It was adjusting internally, like a system responding to accumulated pressure rather than chasing progress alone. Zorvax conveyed that recalibration followed overload. Human consciousness had been stretched beyond parameters it evolved to sustain. Information density, emotional saturation, constant stimulation. The mind adapted not by expanding endlessly, but by reorganizing priorities, sensitivity, and perception in order to survive continued exposure without breaking under invisible pressure of existence. This recalibration explained contradictions scientists could not reconcile. Heightened empathy alongside withdrawal, intuition rising with anxiety, detachment paired with emotional intensity. These were not malfunctions. They were adjustments occurring unevenly across individuals, depending on sensitivity, environment, and willingness to slow rather than resist internal change already underway across humanity itself. Zorvax clarified that evolution implied direction, while recalibration implied balance. Humanity had tipped too far into speed, productivity, abstraction, and external validation. The internal system compensated by dampening motivation, disrupting identity, and amplifying emotional signals to force attention inward, where equilibrium could be restored gradually over extended periods of transition. The discomfort many felt was not failure, it was feedback, a signal indicating misalignment between lived reality and outdated internal structures. Zorvax emphasized that ignoring feedback always led to collapse. Listening to it allowed adaptation. The recalibration demanded patience, presence, and tolerance for uncertainty during prolonged phases of collective adjustment. Progress narratives comforted humanity, while decline narratives frightened it. Both distracted from observation. Recalibration required neither optimism nor despair. It required awareness. Zorvax communicated that civilizations surviving this phase abandoned judgment and learned to witness internal change without forcing resolution before understanding matured across long spans of conscious recalibration cycles. The shift could not be rushed. Attempts to restore old motivation or identities would intensify distress. Humanity was learning to operate differently, though unconsciously. Zorvax made clear this stage was reversible only through awareness, never through acceleration. Speed had caused imbalance. Stillness would reveal alignment within human consciousness itself fully. Paul understood the implication. This was not a moment to fix humanity, but to allow recalibration to complete. Resistance would fracture systems further. Observation would stabilize them. Zorvax did not predict outcomes. It clarified conditions, and the condition now was awareness before reaction, listening before judgment across the collective mind. Paul had followed every dataset, every measurement, every anomaly recorded by laboratories around the globe. He had seen charts, graphs, and statistical models that showed spikes, deviations, correlations, and gaps. Yet none of it explained the phenomenon fully. Zorvax clarified why. The change did not occur in a space that instruments were designed to observe. It existed between measurement and interpretation, in dimensions of experience and perception that science had no way of defining or quantifying. Scientific frameworks depended on isolation, repetition, and replication. Variables could be controlled, causes could be inferred, and effects could be observed within the narrow range of human perception. The phenomenon Paul had sensed, and Zorvax now described, ignored these boundaries entirely. It operated across scales of awareness, internally within minds, socially between individuals, and systemically across cultures, all simultaneously. Its signal was diffuse, subtle, and emergent. Instruments captured fragments, patterns, or correlations, but never the whole. Zorvax explained that instruments read energy, chemistry, or motion. They detected electrical impulses, chemical imbalances, or neural firing. They measured temperature, frequency, oscillation, and pattern. Yet the phenomenon existed as a reconfiguration of the way consciousness itself processed input, assigned meaning, and distributed attention. No sensor could track awareness. No algorithm could replicate its unfolding. Every observation was filtered through the instrument, and every filter imposed limitations that rendered the signal partial. The incompleteness was compounded by temporality. The recalibration was gradual, occurring over decades within lifespans, across generations, and over overlapping social networks. Human instruments expected immediate or measurable responses. By the time trends became statistically significant, the underlying shift had already progressed, internalized, and changed the conditions of measurement themselves. Paul realized that the reason scientists struggled was not incompetence. They had mastered the observable universe. They had not yet learned to measure the invisible, the relational, the subtle forces that reorganized thought, behavior, and attention without leaving an external footprint. Zorvax emphasized that this was not a limitation of intelligence, but of methodology. Existing tools were tuned to detect outcomes, not transitions, effects, not the reorganization beneath them. The revelation left Paul with a profound unease. Humanity had begun a transformation that escaped comprehension by its own instruments. Observers could note consequences. They could attempt to predict effects, but they could not explain the underlying process. And that, Zorvax conveyed, was precisely why the phenomenon would continue unnoticed until awareness itself caught up. Zorvax explained that all modern analysis treated humanity as a collection of observable outputs. Behavior, performance, and measurable interactions were cataloged, graphed, and compared. Economic trends, neurological activity, and social metrics dominated the landscape of understanding. Yet one crucial factor was systematically ignored. One variable existed beyond instruments, beyond replication, and beyond conventional modeling. It was internal experience, the continuous, unquantified awareness each individual carried, shaping perception, decision, and subtle collective influence. Paul considered the implications. Every data set he had studied reduced humans to behaviors, stimuli, and responses. Every anomaly had been treated as external or pathological. Yet the variable Zorvax described could not be observed from the outside. It unfolded entirely within consciousness, influencing actions and social patterns imperceptibly, like a current moving beneath the surface of a still river. It was the dimension that connected awareness, intention, and perception, acting as both catalyst and filter. This internal experience was neither uniform nor predictable. Each human mind carried its own configuration of attention, emotion, memory, and insight. Some oscillated between presence and distraction, others between sensitivity and detachment. These variations interacted across social networks, creating emergent patterns, invisible to measurement, yet shaping reality profoundly. The aggregate of internal experience was not chaos. It was a hidden architecture directing adaptation, response, and transformation. Zorvax emphasized that this variable could not be externalized. Instruments could measure stress hormones, neural oscillations, or hormonal markers, but they could not quantify presence, attention, or meaning. No replication could isolate it because its expression depended on lived context, history, and conscious engagement with the world. Its influence was subtle, gradual, and cumulative. Over decades, it could recalibrate societies, adjust collective priorities, and shift perception of reality itself. Paul reflected on countless reports he had encountered from ordinary individuals: restlessness without cause, heightened empathy alongside withdrawal, sensations of disconnection or intensity unexplained by circumstance. Each was a glimpse of the variable at work. The phenomenon could not be captured by observation alone because it required witnessing from within, a dimension humanity rarely acknowledged systematically. The realization unsettled Paul. Science had neglected the primary engine of change while cataloging every effect it could detect. Internal experience was the signal, the origin, and the driver. It acted silently, invisibly, reshaping priorities, perception, and civilization itself without leaving a measurable footprint. Zorvax conveyed that until humans recognized the power of their own consciousness as an agent of transformation, the patterns would continue unnoticed, accelerating beneath the veneer of functioning systems, until observation and experience could finally converge. Paul began to understand that the phenomenon was less about external events than the way humans processed them. Zorvax described a constant, invisible accumulation occurring within nervous systems. Daily exposure to overwhelming stimuli, images, sounds, notifications, crises, obligations created layers of tension that the body could not fully release. The overload did not register as catastrophic, yet it reverberated subtly through perception, altering behavior, intuition, and emotional response. This was the signal beneath the noise, not the headlines, the statistics, or the measurable outputs, but the cumulative internal effect of living under constant pressure. Humans did not perceive the accumulation consciously. Instead, it manifested as restlessness, distraction, fragmented attention, or inexplicable empathy swings. Society interpreted these reactions as anomalies or pathology, unaware that they were the natural consequence of exposure beyond design tolerance. Zorvax explained that the nervous system functioned as both receptor and integrator. Inputs arrived from the environment, from social interactions, and from digital landscapes. Emotional content traveled alongside physical stimuli, creating feedback loops invisible to traditional observation. Every crisis broadcast, every instant message, every fleeting tragedy amplified the internal current, modifying perception and prioritization. Humans were not malfunctioning. They were responding adaptively to information density and emotional saturation far beyond any historical precedent. Paul reflected on his own experiences. The sensation of overload he had felt for weeks, the sudden empathy spikes, the emotional detachment he could not explain, were microcosms of a global process. Each person carried a piece of the phenomenon within themselves, individually, subtle, collectively shaping society in ways measurable only through secondary effects. Decisions, culture, discourse, and shared priorities shifting without clear causation. The signal was invisible precisely because it was internal, cumulative, and non-linear. Unlike earthquakes or epidemics, it left no immediate trace. The feedback was delayed, appearing in emotional states, thought patterns, and social behavior. Individuals experienced disorientation or restlessness without context. Communities observed anomalies without understanding systemic causation. Instruments detected fragments but never the aggregate effect. Zorvax emphasized that this was the moment civilizations faltered or transformed. The accumulation of unprocessed environmental, informational, and emotional input reached a tipping point where the nervous system demanded adaptation. Conscious awareness of the signal, not its suppression, determined whether recalibration succeeded or societal coherence fractured. Humanity was now immersed in this signal, unaware of its weight, and yet poised on the edge where recognition could fundamentally alter the trajectory of collective existence. Paul sensed a quiet rupture in the way people understood themselves. Identity, the framework humans relied upon to navigate life, had always been a construct, flexible but grounded in familiar reference points. Occupation, family, status, belief systems, social roles. These structures provided stability, a map to interpret experience and predict outcomes. Yet now, many found those maps failing. The old identity no longer contained the present reality. Zorvax conveyed that identity was not merely psychological decoration. It functioned as a system for organizing perception, emotion, and intention. When the external world operated within expected parameters, the system worked. Humans could navigate complexity because their internal frameworks correlated with lived experience. When reality shifted faster than identity could adapt, the system began to falter. Individuals felt lost, anxious, or fragmented not because they lacked skill or intelligence, but because the container of identity was too rigid to accommodate the subtle, pervasive shifts now occurring. The collapse of old identities manifested differently for each person. Some experienced detachment from careers once central to self-definition, suddenly perceiving previous ambitions as hollow or irrelevant. Others felt alienation from relationships that once provided clarity, noticing gaps in understanding, attention, or emotional resonance that had previously been invisible. Even internal dialogue changed. What had been a continuous narrative of competence, value, or belonging fractured into fragments, each fragment demanding new synthesis. Paul realized that this failure of containment was not uniform. It did not affect all humans at once or in the same degree. Sensitivity, exposure, and prior patterns of internal processing influenced how the rupture manifested. Yet the underlying principle remained consistent. The old structures of identity, developed in past conditions, could not fully engage with the cumulative pressures of environmental, informational, and emotional overload, now reshaping perception. The world moved faster than the models humans used to interpret it, and the psyche struggled to catch up. Zorvax emphasized that this stage was necessary. The old identity could not be patched or forced to persist. It was too rigid. Attempting to cling to outdated self-conceptions intensified confusion and anxiety. The rupture exposed areas previously ignored: unexamined beliefs, unrecognized emotions, unresolved impulses, and latent capacities for adaptation. Awareness of these fissures was uncomfortable, yet essential. The system could not recalibrate without first acknowledging the inadequacy of its previous framework. Paul reflected on countless individuals reporting subtle but persistent changes: detachment from prior goals, a sense of dissonance with formerly unquestioned routines, heightened sensitivity to inconsistencies in behavior or information. The patterns were not random. They were emergent consequences of internal recalibration processes operating beneath consciousness, demanding that humans update the architecture of self before attempting to engage with the world in a coherent manner. Zorvax's communication conveyed that identity failure was not a crisis, but a signal. It marked a point where internal awareness must take precedence over external performance. The old container no longer fit, and yet a new form could emerge if attention, reflection, and deliberate presence were applied. Humans who recognized this stage were not lost. They were positioned to lead their own consciousness into alignment with a reality no longer contained by inherited frameworks. Paul understood that the discomfort, disorientation, and doubt felt by many were the markers of a universal phase, one unseen by instruments, unrecorded by statistics, yet profoundly transformative. The old identity could not carry them forward. Only the recalibration of internal systems, the conscious engagement with the self beyond prior limitations, could allow humanity to stabilize within the evolving current of perception and experience. And in that realization, Paul sensed both urgency and possibility, the delicate threshold between collapse and emergence, invisible to the world yet undeniable to those willing to witness it. Paul observed that a quiet resignation had settled over many people. Work, obligations, relationships, and ambitions continued. Yet the energy that once fueled engagement seemed dissipated. Tasks that once inspired satisfaction were now approached with mechanical effort or avoided entirely. The world moved forward, yet some humans appeared to drift behind, tethered to actions without attachment, performing routines while consciousness felt adrift. Zorvax identified this phenomenon as the collapse of motivation, not as failure, laziness, or moral deficit, but as a signal of systemic misalignment. Motivation, Zorvax explained, had always been an internal alignment mechanism. When goals, values, and capacities resonated with the surrounding environment, energy flowed naturally. Humans pursued work, creativity, and connection not solely for reward, but because internal resonance and external context supported each other. When the cumulative pressures of modern life, informational overload, emotional saturation, and rapid environmental shifts disrupted that alignment, the flow of directed energy faltered. The collapse was inevitable, not pathological. This disconnection manifested in subtle ways. People became disengaged from routines they once found meaningful. Burnout spread, not only in workplaces but across social and creative domains. Apathy took hold, not as conscious choice, but as a defense against persistent cognitive and emotional overstimulation. Engagement required realignment with internal systems, and without it, effort became superficial. Tasks were completed in isolation from purpose, and individuals experienced pervasive dissatisfaction. Paul reflected on countless anecdotes: artists abandoning projects mid-creation, professionals leaving careers without clear alternatives, parents feeling strangely detached despite affection for children, communities unable to sustain initiatives once supported enthusiastically. The pattern was everywhere. Yet scientists and observers misinterpreted it as decline, distraction, or failure. Missing the subtle indicator beneath. A civilization recalibrating internally, requiring pause and introspection before energy could be redirected effectively. Zorvax emphasized that this phase was essential. The collapse of motivation served as a feedback mechanism, a signal that existing goals, assumptions, and practices were no longer viable within the evolving context of collective human consciousness. Attempting to force continuation without recognition of internal shifts exacerbated disengagement, creating cycles of fatigue, frustration, and misdirected effort. Energy could be restored only by attending to internal alignment rather than external expectations, allowing the system to synchronize gradually with present realities. The alien conveyed that periods of inertia, fatigue, or apathy were not wasted time. They were preparatory, opportunities for internal reflection, reorganization of priorities, and adjustment of self-concepts. Societies and individuals that respected this period, that paused to observe the signals, found themselves poised to recover motivation in forms that were sustainable, resilient, and attuned to the new internal environment. Paul understood that this stage of collapse was not a symptom of weakness, but a call to awareness. Humanity's seeming loss of drive was not permanent. It was an invitation to reconsider the structures of effort, meaning, and purpose. Those who heeded it could re-emerge with a deeper, more coherent engagement with the world, harnessing internal alignment as the true source of sustainable action. Those who ignored it risked exhaustion, disconnection, and repeated cycles of misaligned energy, unable to recover until the signal could no longer be overlooked. In this quiet collapse of motivation, Paul discerned both warning and potential, a threshold invisible to society, yet critical for the trajectory of collective consciousness. Paul listened as Zorvax shifted perspective, drawing the view beyond Earth. The alien described civilizations scattered across distant star systems, each unique in biology, culture, and environment, yet all exhibiting the same subtle patterns. There were no dramatic wars marking the turning points, no immediate collapses of cities or economies. Instead, before any civilization reached a critical transition, a phase of internal dissonance emerged, nearly invisible from the outside. Citizens appeared functional, routines continued, yet beneath the surface, internal structures were recalibrating, subtly reshaping priorities, attention, and collective perception. Zorvax conveyed that the phenomenon was universal, not contingent upon resources, climate, or technology. Species separated by millions of years of evolution displayed remarkably similar behavioral shifts before transformative events. Motivation faltered, identities fractured, empathy fluctuated unpredictably, and attention fragmented. Societies appeared chaotic. Yet this chaos was not the cause of collapse. It was the symptom of an internal process, a necessary stage in the alignment of collective consciousness with emerging conditions. Paul reflected on human patterns he had observed and realized they mirrored these distant examples precisely. The nervous systems responding to overload, the collapse of conventional identity, the quiet disengagement from once stable goals, all of it had precedent among civilizations light years away. Zorvax emphasized that the repetition was not coincidence. There was an underlying architecture of consciousness, a set of principles governing adaptation, perception, and internal organization, visible only to those capable of observing both individual and systemic interactions simultaneously. The alien described civilizations that recognized the phase early, societies that attuned to internal signals, that adjusted values, attention, and engagement consciously, experienced transformation without catastrophic loss. They emerged with new capacities, increased resilience, and coherence aligned to environmental and informational realities. Those that ignored the signs, dismissed fatigue, apathy, or detachment as weakness or randomness, faced degradation of structure, relational collapse, and eventual systemic failure. The timeline could span decades or centuries, yet the underlying dynamics were consistent. The stage of disconnection preceded either recalibration or decline. Paul considered the implications. The signs of internal recalibration on Earth were not failures but signals. Humanity was at a threshold, unremarked by most, yet critically poised for either adaptation or prolonged disintegration. Observation alone was insufficient. Recognition, conscious engagement, and deliberate realignment were required. Zorvax communicated that civilizations could learn from distant examples, yet only if the inhabitants were willing to confront the subtle, invisible processes within themselves. The aliens' words painted a paradoxical image. Civilizations that appeared ordinary, even prosperous, were in the midst of profound internal upheaval. Systems functioned, individuals performed roles, yet beneath the surface, awareness itself was shifting. These transitions, imperceptible to conventional measurement, determined the trajectory of societies across the cosmos. Paul understood that Earth was not unique. Its current phase was part of a repeating pattern, one that demanded attention to the unseen variables of consciousness, presence, and alignment. Failure to heed them would not be sudden but inevitable, a quiet erosion preceding visible collapse, just as it had been elsewhere among the stars. Paul sensed that the shifts unfolding within humanity were not linear. There was an ebb and flow, a subtle rhythm that defied conventional measurement. Zorvax explained that the current stage was one of profound disorientation, a phase every civilization passed through when collective consciousness began to exceed the boundaries of its established frameworks. This was not a visible calamity. No buildings crumbled, no economies failed. Instead, the destabilization occurred internally, shaping perception, emotion, and social cohesion in ways that were invisible to the casual observer yet unmistakable to those who attended carefully. The disorientation manifested first as cognitive strain. Individuals reported difficulty maintaining attention, moments of mental fog, or sudden shifts in priorities without apparent cause. Familiar routines lost their meaning, decisions felt arbitrary, and the internal narrative of self began to fragment. Traditional markers of stability, career achievements, relationships, social roles no longer grounded the psyche in the same way. People were still acting, functioning, performing daily obligations, yet each action was infused with a subtle unease, an underlying sense that the map no longer matched the territory. Emotionally, the landscape was equally complex. Empathy surged unpredictably, sometimes expanding to encompass strangers or abstract concepts, only to collapse into apathy or irritability moments later. Anxiety and exhilaration intertwined, creating fluctuations that had no clear external trigger. Communities experienced similar tremors. Conversations once predictable now revealed fractures, small disputes escalating without precedent, cooperation faltering despite necessity. Social cohesion weakened because the invisible internal recalibration of individuals was outpacing collective adaptation. Zorvax emphasized that this stage was essential. Disorientation was not a flaw, failure, or symptom of societal decline. It was a signal, a structural phase of consciousness in transition. As internal processing systems expanded, existing mental and social architectures could not contain them without disruption. Civilization appeared chaotic, yet the disorder was intrinsic to adaptation. Those who recognized the pattern could navigate it with awareness, cultivating presence, reflection, and deliberate realignment. Those who ignored it, dismissed unease as irrational, or blamed external circumstances exclusively, risked amplifying fragmentation and prolonging suffering unnecessarily. Paul considered examples he had witnessed. Individuals abandoning projects mid-course, social groups splintering over minor disagreements, entire professional communities struggling with uncertainty despite stable external conditions. Each was a microcosm of the larger recalibration, evidence of internal processes interacting with external structures in imperfect harmony. Zorvax conveyed that these patterns were universal. Civilizations light years distant had experienced identical disorientation, a prelude to either transformation or breakdown. The variables were consistent: cognitive strain, emotional volatility, social fragmentation. How each civilization responded determined its trajectory. He realized the quiet power of this phase. Disorientation was not merely chaos, it was a crucible. Within it, awareness could expand, identities could be redefined, and collective structures could evolve to accommodate heightened perception and internal complexity. Ignored, it could harden into persistent dysfunction. The inertia of unrecognized transformation. Humanity existed now within this crucible, suspended between the risk of prolonged confusion and the potential for conscious recalibration, an invisible threshold with consequences extending far beyond immediate perception. Paul observed that not all humans were experiencing the shifts at the same pace. Some moved through the emerging disorientation with striking speed, their inner frameworks adapting more rapidly than those around them. Zorvax explained that this acceleration was not random. It depended on a constellation of factors intrinsic to consciousness itself: sensitivity to subtle signals, habitual introspection, and the depth of emotional engagement with internal experience. Individuals who possessed these traits were more attuned to the subtle currents shaping collective change, able to perceive discrepancies, contradictions, and latent possibilities that others overlooked. These faster-changing humans often felt out of step with their peers. Routine interactions, once familiar and predictable, now seemed superficial or dissonant. They noticed patterns in behavior, communication, and environment that went unrecognized by the majority. Emotional intensity amplified this perception. A fleeting moment of empathy or insight could trigger profound realizations about personal and societal dynamics, accelerating recalibration. Such individuals reported feeling both isolated and unusually aware, caught between the inertia of conventional structures and the emergent flow of internal realignment. Zorvax emphasized that this process was not inherently advantageous or burdensome. It was a reflection of the internal capacity to process complexity, to integrate multiple layers of experience simultaneously. The accelerated shifts exposed weaknesses in traditional identity constructs. Old goals, inherited expectations, and habitual responses failed to accommodate the increased flow of information and emotional resonance. Those who adapted quickly could restructure internal narratives, updating their sense of self in alignment with evolving reality. Those who resisted or remained unaware experienced confusion, frustration, or fatigue, trapped in patterns that no longer served coherence or purpose. Paul considered the stories he had gathered: young professionals abandoning careers they had spent years constructing, artists and creators discarding familiar methods to experiment with new forms of expression, parents noticing subtle shifts in perception that rendered old habits of teaching or nurturing inadequate. In each case, the common denominator was heightened receptivity, an ability to sense the underlying forces of change before they fully manifested externally. Zorvax conveyed that this was a universal mechanism, recurring in civilizations across the cosmos. Sensitivity functioned as an early warning system, an adaptive accelerant for those prepared to heed it. Yet, speed carried paradoxical consequences. Those who changed rapidly often faced social dissonance, perceived as unpredictable or alien by peers who remained slower in adaptation. Emotional intensity could overwhelm if not tempered by deliberate reflection. Insights emerged as flashes of clarity, but integration required patience and disciplined observation. Zorvax emphasized that acceleration alone was not sufficient. It was the combination of heightened awareness and conscious alignment that allowed individuals to navigate the phase safely. Paul realized that humanity contained pockets of these accelerated individuals, quietly recalibrating in parallel with the slower majority. Their experiences were both a signal and a guide, a glimpse of what might emerge when consciousness caught up with its own evolution. These humans were not leading or teaching in conventional terms. They were quietly recalibrating, preparing internal systems for the broader transitions that awaited, bridging the subtle currents of awareness with the unfolding reality around them. They moved faster because they were listening more closely, sensing the unseen, and responding to the invisible architecture of transformation that governed both mind and society. Paul noted a recurring pattern among the faster-changing humans. Many described a profound unease, a gnawing sensation that something within them had gone awry. They spoke of disconnection from prior goals, confusion about identity, and emotional oscillations that felt uncontrollable. The phrases were strikingly similar. "I feel broken." "Something is wrong with me." "I am not the person I used to be." Zorvax observed these reports with a quiet gravity, explaining that this perception was a natural misinterpretation of the deeper processes unfolding within consciousness. Transformation at the scale occurring now often created a sense of internal mismatch. The body, the mind, and habitual responses had evolved incrementally, yet the interior awareness surged ahead, recalibrating in ways that defied previous norms. Humans experience this as instability, disorientation, or dysfunction, because the old frames of reference, cultural expectations, personal identity, social roles were no longer sufficient to contain the expanded perception. What appeared pathological was, in fact, the beginning of a systemic reorganization, a necessary reshuffling of internal priorities, emotional resonance, and attentional patterns. Zorvax emphasized that the mislabeling of transformation as sickness was reinforced by societal structures, medical and psychological frameworks, optimized for static conditions, measured deviation against historical norms. They evaluated behaviors, thoughts, and emotional states without context for emergent shifts in consciousness. Sleep disruption, heightened intuition, fluctuating emotional intensity, and intermittent motivation were all treated as anomalies, abnormalities, or disorders, yet each was a sign of active recalibration, a signal that the internal system was reorganizing to accommodate broader perceptual and emotional capacities. Paul reflected on the countless testimonies of humans who feared judgment or intervention. Adults questioned their sanity. Teenagers felt estranged from peers. Entire communities described waves of restlessness and silent anxiety that resisted explanation. Zorvax conveyed that this pattern was consistent across civilizations. The moment consciousness exceeded the bounds of inherited or learned frameworks, those undergoing transformation experienced a sense of dysfunction. Only when viewed within the context of internal recalibration did these experiences appear coherent, purposeful, and temporary, rather than pathological. The alien further explained that awareness of this distinction could accelerate adaptation. Recognition that internal turbulence was a signal, not a defect, allowed individuals to shift from fear to observation. They could note emotional spikes, periods of confusion, and identity flux as data rather than judgment, as markers of realignment rather than failure. Societies that permitted space for such observation, that did not force immediate normalization or remediation, preserved the integrity of emergent capacities, creating conditions for accelerated evolution without collapse under self-reproach. Paul realized the subtle terror embedded in the misunderstanding. Humans interpreted their own evolution as disease because the old systems of measurement, validation, and expectation had not caught up. Transformation required patience, context, and trust in unseen processes. The phrase, "something is wrong with me," was not a confession of weakness. It was the echo of consciousness, recalibrating, reaching beyond obsolete structures, and quietly signaling the emergence of capabilities that had no previous metric, no conventional explanation, yet a profound, silent necessity. Paul reflected on the countless reports of interventions, therapies, medications, and societal prescriptions aimed at correcting what was perceived as dysfunction. Zorvax observed that this was a recurring error across civilizations. The pattern was always the same. Systems identified visible disturbances and sought to eliminate or suppress them without tracing the underlying shift. Emotional volatility, sudden detachment, cognitive lapses, and fluctuating motivation were treated as problems in themselves rather than as signals of deeper internal recalibration. Civilization interpreted the surface as the entirety, missing the invisible currents that governed the change. The alien explained that symptoms were not the cause of imbalance. They were indicators that internal structures were actively realigning. Attempts to suppress them often generated resistance, amplifying disorientation and slowing the integration of new perceptual capacities. A society focused on restoring the old equilibrium risked enforcing stagnation, reinforcing outdated frameworks, and suppressing emergent abilities. Individuals became trapped in cycles of correction, repeating patterns of anxiety, fatigue, and frustration because the measures addressed the manifestation rather than the source. Paul considered the reports he had studied. Workplaces implementing productivity interventions for disengaged employees, schools adjusting curricula to manage students' attention deficits, governments instituting regulations to normalize social behavior. Each effort sought control over the visible effects, yet none accounted for the internal transformation quietly unfolding within the collective consciousness. Zorvax emphasized that civilizations attempting to contain or eradicate these symptoms often accelerated fragmentation, as the systems themselves resisted the pressure of unconscious adaptation. The alien conveyed that a subtle awareness of causality could dramatically alter the trajectory of change. Recognizing that fluctuations, anxieties, and disengagement were not defects, but indicators allowed individuals and societies to shift perspective. Observation replaced correction. Understanding replaced suppression. People could learn to navigate internal turbulence, integrate emerging capacities, and develop resilience to the invisible forces shaping attention, motivation, and relational perception. Paul realized the insidious consequences of treating symptoms as independent problems. It created an illusion of stability while the underlying processes continued, unacknowledged, and unregulated. Individuals were medicated, trained, or disciplined to appear functional. Yet internally, their consciousness was misaligned with the evolving currents of reality. Societal structures attempted to impose coherence externally, but internal dissonance multiplied quietly, leaving civilizations ill-prepared for the next phase of transformation. Zorvax explained that the error was universal because systemic frameworks relied on historical precedent and measurable data. Transformation, by contrast, occurred in dimensions beyond conventional observation. Internal experience, subtle attention shifts, and the recalibration of perception could not be quantified with existing instruments. Civilizations that clung to old methods, insisting on controlling the manifestations rather than attending to the underlying shift, consistently encountered stagnation, extended disorientation, and the eventual erosion of adaptive capacity. Paul understood that the key to navigating the current phase was not correction but perception. Humanity's challenge was to witness the turbulence, not suppress it, to recognize the invisible recalibration as legitimate, necessary, and temporary. Only through this acknowledgement could the transition proceed without unnecessary suffering. And only then could emergent abilities take root and integrate into the broader social and cognitive fabric of the species. The civilization's survival, he realized, depended less on controlling appearances than on aligning with the currents beneath the surface. Paul began to perceive a subtle yet undeniable tension woven into the transformation. Zorvax explained that every civilization undergoing such a phase faced a hidden choice: embedded in the very currents of change itself. It was not imposed by leaders, governments, or external events. It arose from the internal calibration of consciousness, appearing as a fork in perception where adaptation and resistance coexisted, each with consequences that would unfold over decades. The choice was invisible to most. It did not manifest as a command or decree, but as the cumulative effects of attention, presence, and awareness. Those who resisted clung to familiar patterns, seeking to maintain comfort, predictability, and alignment with inherited norms. They attempted to suppress internal signals, correct fluctuations, and restore old identities, believing this would stabilize both themselves and the broader society. Yet resistance carried subtle costs. Energy expended in opposition created fatigue, emotional rigidity, and increased dissonance between perception and action. The systems of old could not fully accommodate the emergent currents, and those resisting experienced mounting tension, manifesting as stress, alienation, and an uneasy sense that something essential had been lost. Adaptation, in contrast, was neither simple nor passive. It required conscious observation, deliberate engagement with internal shifts, and a willingness to allow old structures to dissolve, partially in service of integration. Individuals choosing adaptation embraced moments of uncertainty, periods of disorientation, and the destabilizing effect of emerging perception. They cultivated patience, discernment, and the ability to witness internal turbulence without judgment. This path demanded courage because it offered no immediate reward, no external validation, and no certainty. Yet those who pursued it aligned their internal systems with the broader evolutionary currents, accelerating integration and creating coherence where chaos had begun. Zorvax emphasized that the choice was collective as well as individual. When enough humans embraced adaptation, the phase could unfold with minimal societal disruption, enabling institutions, culture, and relationships to recalibrate alongside consciousness. Resistance, if dominant, amplified fragmentation, prolonging disorientation and increasing the likelihood of structural breakdown. The alien conveyed that history demonstrated this pattern repeatedly. Civilizations that recognized the embedded choice, even partially, were able to navigate transformation and emerge with enhanced capacity, while those that denied it suffered extended stagnation, social tension, and cultural erosion. Paul realized that the choice was not always conscious for those involved. It often manifested in small, seemingly insignificant decisions, whether to question assumptions or cling to them, to observe internal states or suppress them, to engage with emerging insight or dismiss it. These micro-decisions compounded across individuals and communities, shaping the trajectory of adaptation or resistance. Awareness itself became the lever of influence, the unseen mechanism by which a civilization either aligned with the currents of transformation or remained entangled in inherited structures that no longer served survival. The gravity of the choice pressed silently on Paul. It was not merely about change. It was about the capacity to see the forces operating beneath ordinary perception and to act in harmony with them. Humanity had reached the point where internal calibration could no longer be ignored. Every thought, decision, and attention directed inward became part of the invisible architecture of the future. Zorvax made it clear. The currents of evolution were present, impartial, and unavoidable. The only variable was whether humans would move with them or against them. In that choice lay the trajectory of generations, the difference between silent decay and conscious emergence, the subtle but decisive divergence that would define the era. Paul observed a striking divergence in the ways humans responded to the subtle shift unfolding across the planet. Zorvax explained that this divergence was natural, a bifurcation inherent to the phase of recalibration. One group sought to maintain control through external mechanisms, clinging to routines, authority structures, and familiar distractions. They increased reliance on schedules, technology, and social performance. attempting to impose order on a reality whose currents had already shifted beyond their comprehension. For them, busyness became a shield, information an armor, and distraction a method of survival. Anxiety surged, yet it was channeled into effort, management, and reaction rather than reflection. The surface of life remained organized, functional even, but beneath it, subtle fractures expanded, invisible to the participants, yet palpable to those attuned to the emerging patterns. The second group moved inward. They slowed their pace, observing the dissonance in themselves and others without resistance. Restlessness, confusion, and uncertainty were not fought, but examined. Emotional fluctuations became data rather than threats, and disconnection was met with presence rather than correction. In their stillness, new perceptual capacities began to emerge. Time expanded as attention shifted from the constant noise of expectation to the subtle signals of awareness. Social and cultural norms faded from immediate concern, allowing these individuals to recalibrate internal systems, rebuild attentional infrastructure, and integrate the emergent currents of consciousness. Zorvax noted that the divergence was self-reinforcing. Those pursuing control often criticized, ridiculed, or avoided the inward path, perceiving it as idleness or weakness. The inward group, sensing the futility of external control over the invisible currents, withdrew from forced alignment, creating pockets of observation and integration that further amplified their internal coherence. Civilization began to contain dual currents, one accelerating the external illusion of stability, while the other deepened subtle internal evolution. The tension between them was not merely social. It was energetic, informational, and psychological, shaping the emergent trajectory of collective adaptation. Paul realized that neither path was inherently right or wrong, but each carried consequences. The outward-focused group maintained the structures of the past, providing apparent stability yet resisting the integration necessary for long-term resilience. The inward-focused group cultivated emergent capacities, increasing internal coherence and perceptual clarity, but risked marginalization and disconnection from the larger society. Zorvax conveyed that this divergence had always occurred when consciousness exceeded the capacity of inherited frameworks. It was neither accidental nor abnormal. It was the natural expression of adaptation under conditions of rapid internal change. Paul considered the subtle indicators he had observed: the increasing polarization of attention, the fracturing of shared experience, the simultaneous overconnection and withdrawal in communities. These were not failures or malfunctions. They were the visible reflection of the bifurcation unfolding within human consciousness. The alien emphasized that the outcome depended on the proportion of each response, the willingness of individuals to engage with internal reality rather than external illusion. Two currents flowed through humanity now, each shaping the path ahead. The question lingered: which current would guide the emergent civilization, and which would fade quietly into obsolescence? Resistance carries a subtle weight that accumulates unnoticed until it manifests as systemic strain. When transformation is treated as pathology, when internal recalibration is perceived as a threat rather than a signal, the energy required to maintain appearances intensifies. Societies erect barriers of distraction, control, and prescription, convincing themselves that functionality is preserved, yet each measure conceals an internal erosion. Zorvax explained that the cost of resisting was rarely immediate but insidious, slowly corroding cohesion, perception, and capacity for adaptation. Discomfort proliferates in patterns too subtle to measure. Emotional rigidity spreads through families, workplaces, and communities, reinforcing the illusion of normalcy while fracturing the internal landscape of consciousness. Anxiety, fatigue, and disconnection are treated as deviations rather than manifestations of a deeper shift. The cumulative effect is a society operating on autopilot, technically functional but internally fragmented, where the energy to maintain control consumes resources that could have supported awareness, integration, and resilience. History demonstrates the universality of this pattern. Civilizations that misidentified the phase of recalibration as disorder applied measures to suppress the visible symptoms. Leaders imposed structures, rituals, and systems intended to normalize behavior. Communities reinforced conformity, prioritizing routine over presence. Individuals, internalizing these pressures, experienced a growing dissonance between perception and action. Motivation waned, creativity stagnated, and subtle perceptual capacities atrophied. The civilization remained intact on the surface, yet internally, it was fracturing, increasingly vulnerable to shocks, crises, and cumulative stress. Zorvax conveyed that the consequences extend beyond individual suffering. Social bonds weaken when attention is continually redirected outward to impose structures rather than inward toward awareness. Institutions lose the capacity to respond adaptively, as they are designed for the stability of the past rather than the dynamics of emergent currents. Culture becomes superficial, a veneer of continuity masking an interior collapse of coherence. Patterns of behavior, once adaptive, become maladaptive, perpetuating disconnection while appearing to maintain order. The alien emphasized that resistance is seductive because it promises control and familiarity, yet it is self-limiting. Energy expended in opposition to the currents of transformation cannot be recovered. Those who resist experience cumulative strain in ways invisible to conventional measurement. Chronic stress, psychosomatic ailments, diminished creativity, and impaired social intuition. Over generations, these effects compound, producing a civilization capable of functioning technically but unable to navigate emergent complexity. Internal tension, Zorvax explained, is the warning signal most ignored. It is the price of denying recalibration, of treating adaptation as dysfunction rather than as the natural expression of an evolving system. Civilization may continue for decades in apparent stability, yet the underlying erosion quietly accelerates. The cost is measured not in immediate catastrophe, but in lost opportunity, diminished capacity, and the gradual collapse of resilience. Resistance is not violent in the conventional sense, yet it fractures the internal architecture upon which survival, innovation, and conscious integration depend. The choice is always present. Recognition of the currents, observation of internal dissonance, and conscious engagement with transformation offer a path to stability and integration. Ignoring them ensures that the cost will compound, invisible until it reaches a threshold where recovery requires far greater effort. The consequences of denial are both subtle and absolute, shaping the trajectory of generations before the first visible cracks appear. A different horizon emerges when integration occurs. Zorvax explained that humanity has the capacity to absorb the currents of change rather than resist them, and when enough individuals engage intentionally, the internal architecture of consciousness stabilizes. The process is subtle, often imperceptible to those still moving at the pace of distraction, yet it produces measurable coherence in perception, emotion, and action. Attention becomes more deliberate, awareness more expansive, and the default state of consciousness shifts from reaction to observation. Patterns of internal turbulence begin to settle. Emotional intensity remains, but it is experienced rather than unconsciously projected outward. Anxiety and agitation diminish not because the external world has changed, but because the internal framework has recalibrated to accommodate it. Decision-making is guided by clarity rather than compulsion. Relationships evolve from automatic interactions into conscious engagements, where presence becomes the foundation of connection rather than mere habit. Communities retain structures and routines, but these are now infused with deliberation, reflection, and adaptability, allowing for continuity without stagnation. Integration also alters perception of time and causality. Events no longer dictate reaction in a reflexive loop. Instead, observation and reflection precede action. and the nervous system responds with measured alignment rather than default urgency. Zorvax emphasized that this state does not imply passivity or withdrawal from responsibility. On the contrary, it enables an unprecedented capacity to act effectively within complexity, to respond to emergent challenges with insight rather than mere impulse. The civilization that integrates does not erase chaos, but reorganizes perception so that it becomes intelligible, navigable, and instructive rather than overwhelming. Energy distribution within communities shifts. The effort once spent maintaining appearances and control is redirected toward presence, understanding, and the cultivation of coherence. Education, work, and culture adapt to reinforce internal alignment rather than superficial productivity. Curiosity, creativity, and innovation flourish because individuals are able to sustain focus, absorb subtle patterns, and integrate new information into existing frameworks. Collective intelligence begins to emerge not as an abstract concept, but as a tangible byproduct of aligned internal states distributed across populations. Zorvax indicated that integration has a self-reinforcing quality. The more individuals attune to the currents of transformation, the more the social and cultural environment supports coherence. Feedback loops form, where presence begets presence. Observation catalyzes insight, and calm response generates stability. Over time, the civilization experiences what might be called a quiet revolution. No visible upheaval, no dramatic spectacle, but a profound transformation in the rhythm of life itself. The alien emphasized that this state is possible now, not in the distant future. It requires conscious engagement, sustained attention to internal states, and recognition that the currents of change are not adversaries but signals guiding recalibration. Humanity has arrived at a threshold where the choice between silent collapse and deliberate integration is immediate, ongoing, and reversible. The potential is immense. The consequences of action, or inaction, extend across generations, shaping the internal and external architecture of civilization long before history registers a single event. Integration is not a promise, it is a possibility, a subtle alignment of perception, attention, and consciousness that alters the trajectory of a species quietly but irreversibly. The currents of change were accelerating, though few could perceive them. Zorvax conveyed that humanity was approaching a threshold, a moment in which the subtle divergence between adaptation and resistance would crystallize into a trajectory that could no longer be reversed. The point was not a single event, but a gradual convergence of internal and external factors, the cumulative weight of countless micro-decisions, attentional habits, and emotional patterns. Every skipped moment of awareness, every unexamined reaction, contributed to the alignment of humanity along one of two paths. Those who had embraced presence, slowed thought, and observed internal states had begun to generate pockets of coherence within the collective. Their nervous systems responded with clarity, their perceptions attuned to patterns invisible to the distracted, and their interactions carried stabilizing resonance. Small communities, workplaces, and families reflected the effects of this integration, rippling outward in subtle but measurable ways. Yet these currents remained fragile, easily obscured by the dominant forces of distraction, conformity, and internal disconnection that had already gained momentum across much of society. Resistance continued to dominate in the majority. Habits of control, distraction, and avoidance of self-reflection persisted, producing layers of tension, fatigue, and misalignment. Social structures functioned in appearance, yet underneath, stress and internal fragmentation accumulated like silent tectonic pressure. Conventional systems, designed for efficiency and predictability, struggled to respond to phenomena they could not measure or predict. The civilization operated at a surface stability that concealed an undercurrent of vulnerability. Zorvax observed that the longer the disconnection persisted, the greater the cost, and the narrower the margin for reversal. Paul considered the invisible forces at play. The threshold was both structural and experiential. It existed in the cumulative capacity of individuals to respond to change consciously, to integrate disruption without rejecting it, and to cultivate presence in the midst of chaos. The alien explained that once a critical mass of awareness was reached, the civilization could stabilize along the path of integration almost spontaneously, as coherent patterns reinforce one another. Conversely, if inertia, resistance, and denial dominated, the collective would cascade toward fragmentation, unable to recover without extraordinary intervention, a systemic recalibration requiring far greater energy than had been lost to subtle neglect. The threshold was also temporal. Time itself functioned differently for the currents of consciousness. Small, consistent practices of awareness accumulated significance, creating leverage over outcomes. Neglect amplified the distance to the point of irreversible collapse. The alien emphasized that the threshold was not merely abstract but tangible, embedded in the alignment of internal capacities across billions of individuals. The moments available to shift course were narrowing, yet the possibility remained. Zorvax conveyed that observation alone was insufficient. The threshold demanded engagement, intentionality, and courage. Humanity stood at the cusp, neither doomed nor assured. The path forward depended on recognition of the invisible currents, willingness to act in alignment with internal reality, and the quiet cultivation of coherence that, while imperceptible to many, held the key to survival. The choice was imminent, and the consequences would extend far beyond the visible horizon, shaping the structure, perception, and destiny of civilization for generations. Zorvax remained present yet distant, a silent sentinel whose purpose was not to steer but to illuminate. He explained that intervention was neither necessary nor desirable, that the currents of human transformation could not be imposed from without. To act would be to disrupt the process itself, to prevent the emergence of authentic recalibration that arose only when the species engaged its own internal mechanisms. Observation, he emphasized, carried weight. It transmitted subtle resonance, a template of attention and presence, but it was not a replacement for choice. The alien conveyed that every civilization Zorvax had witnessed faced the same challenge. External interference often produced temporary stabilization, but never genuine adaptation. Patterns corrected under compulsion collapsed once the force was removed, leaving underlying structures unresolved. Evolution, or recalibration, he said, required the organism to navigate disruption autonomously, to confront the friction between internal capacity and external reality, to endure disorientation and arrive at coherence without shortcut or external imposition. Humanity's current moment was such a threshold, and any intervention would preempt the emergence of true understanding. Paul reflected on the paradox. Humanity could falter spectacularly or shift subtly, quietly, but the margin for error was shrinking. Zorvax explained that his presence amplified awareness indirectly, creating subtle resonances that nudged perception without violating autonomy. The alien's role was to mirror possibilities, reveal patterns invisible to conventional measurement, and guide observation without compelling action. To intervene would be to deprive humans of the very process through which insight, self-correction, and coherent adaptation emerged. The choice was intensely personal, yet collectively consequential. Every individual who cultivated presence, who slowed thought, and who observed internal and social patterns contributed to stabilization. Every act of resistance, avoidance, or distraction amplified disconnection and tension. Zorvax clarified that he did not judge, nor did he apply a metric of success. Outcomes were the natural result of alignment or misalignment, coherence or fragmentation. His concern was understanding, mapping, and recording, transmitting subtle impressions that could support conscious engagement but never replace it. Time itself was not linear in the context of these currents. Zorvax noted that subtle shifts now could resonate across decades, even centuries. The potential for collective coherence remained latent in the actions of those few who observed deeply and acted with intention. Conversely, inattention would propagate instability, a quiet erosion that would amplify until the threshold passed irreversibly. The alien emphasized that humanity's fate was neither predetermined nor protected. The responsibility rested entirely with the species itself, in its engagement with awareness, presence, and the capacity to perceive patterns invisible to conventional analysis. Zorvax's presence was therefore paradoxical. He was intimately involved, yet fundamentally apart, offering clarity without force, guidance without prescription, resonance without interference. Humanity's journey would be shaped not by his power, but by the degree to which the species could internalize the signals of change, integrate disruption, and consciously participate in the unfolding of its own consciousness. Intervention was impossible because the moment demanded authenticity. Rescue would cancel the very evolution the currents had begun. He would witness, illuminate, and wait. Observation alone was both the tool and the threshold. The revelation arrived without ceremony, without grand displays, yet it carried a weight that reverberated through every unobserved corner of consciousness. Zorvax conveyed that what humanity perceived as fragmentation, confusion, and instability was not collapse, but the awakening of capacities long dormant. The disruption, the disorientation, the sense of being untethered, all were facets of a process of remembering, not inventing, of recalling patterns embedded deep within human physiology and psyche that had been obscured over generations. Paul absorbed the implications slowly, recognizing that the turbulence he had witnessed in the eyes, gestures, and speech of those around him reflected something more profound than psychological or social phenomena. Humans were not failing. They were reconnecting to faculties that had always existed but were muted beneath layers of distraction, fear, and externally imposed expectation. Zorvax described this as a reclamation of internal coherence, a recalibration of perception, attention, and resonance. The apparent chaos was not a deficit but a signal, a diagnostic of a system awakening to its own depth. The alien emphasized that memory of these capacities was not uniform. Some individuals felt it as sudden clarity, others as a slow unraveling of old certainties. The nervous system, the emotional matrix, and the subtle senses of perception all participated, recalibrating in concert yet not simultaneously. The process was uneven and unevenly interpreted, which explained why some reacted with fear, some with denial, and some with profound insight. Humanity was navigating a phase of remembering, and memory always feels like novelty until recognition solidifies. Zorvax explained that this return was neither trivial nor effortless. Resistance, unconscious or deliberate, extended the process and amplified discomfort. Misalignment, avoidance, and clinging to outdated constructs produced fatigue, confusion, and estrangement. Yet every act of presence, every moment of observing internal states, every conscious choice to engage rather than avoid, accelerated the reclamation. Memory unfolded through attention, reflection, and subtle resonance, not through instruction or external enforcement. Paul realized that the implications extended beyond the individual. If enough people remembered their internal capacities, the resonance would amplify collectively, shifting societal norms, perception, and cohesion in ways invisible to conventional measurement. The invisible threads connecting internal states across individuals could form stabilizing currents, reinforcing coherence, empathy, and perceptual acuity. Civilization itself could shift along these currents, guided by the remembered capacities of its participants, rather than imposed structure or external authority. The choice, Zorvax clarified, was urgent yet silent. Humanity could continue distracted, fragmented, and reactive, prolonging disorientation and confusion indefinitely. Or it could engage the remembering, cultivate presence, and allow the restoration of internal coherence to influence collective patterns. There was no external rescue, no enforcement, no guarantee. The responsibility, the possibility, and the power rested entirely within the species itself. The alien's presence faded slightly, yet the resonance remained, an imprint of awareness, a call to action without words. Humanity was not breaking, humanity was remembering, and the next moments would determine whether that memory would flourish or remain dormant, a subtle signal beneath the noise of everyday life.